The first time my name came over the intercom, it didn't sound like trouble. It sounded polite, almost gentle. "Ethan Miller, please report to the principal's office." Still, my stomach tightened as if my body understood something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I worked afternoons at Brookfield Academy's administrative desk to help cover tuition, a quiet job that fit my quiet nature. I followed rules. I kept my head down. I didn't give people reasons to call me into offices with closed doors. As I walked down the hallway, the familiar sounds of lockers and distant laughter faded, replaced by the soft thud of my own footsteps and the persistent thought that I must have done something wrong. Daniel Harris, the principal, stood when I entered. He was younger than most principals I'd known, early 40s maybe, with a calm confidence that didn't need to announce itself. His office smelled faintly of coffee and old books. He gestured for me to sit, his movements unhurried, as if time behaved differently around him. "Ethan," he said, smiling in a way that felt considered rather than automatic. "You're not in any trouble." Relief washed over me, quickly followed by confusion. If this wasn't a reprimand, then what was it? Daniel explained that he'd noticed my work ethic, the way I handled students and parents with patience, the way I stayed late without being asked. His voice was steady, professional, but there was something else beneath it, attention. I wasn't used to being studied so closely by anyone in authority, and certainly not by a man like him. I nodded, thanked him, said all the right things. Inside, I felt strangely exposed, like a light had been turned on in a room I hadn't realized was dark. When I left his office, nothing tangible had changed. My job was the same. My schedule was the same. But I carried his gaze with me, the sense that I had been seen in a way that lingered uncomfortably. That night, Ryan barely looked up from his phone when I told him about my day. We'd been together for almost 2 years, long enough for routines to replace curiosity. Ryan was kind, dependable, and distant in ways that were hard to articulate without sounding ungrateful. He listened, technically, but his attention felt borrowed, already promised elsewhere. "That's good," he said, eyes still glowing from the screen. "Needs to be appreciated." I agreed, but the word appreciated echoed in my mind longer than it should have. Over the next week, Daniel called me in twice more. Once to help organize records, once to ask my opinion on a student outreach idea. Each meeting was brief, appropriate, and undeniably personal. He remembered details I hadn't expected him to keep: my major, my plans after graduation, the fact that I preferred silence to noise. "You think before you speak," he said during the second visit. "That's rare." I laughed it off, but his observation followed me back to my desk, settling somewhere deep and warm. With Ryan, conversations felt like parallel tracks. With Daniel, they felt like intersections. I didn't tell Ryan about the second meeting. I told myself it wasn't worth mentioning, that it would only sound strange if I made it sound strange. Still, the omission sat heavy in my chest, small but deliberate. During the third meeting, there was a pause, just a second too long, after Daniel asked if I was happy. Not academically, not professionally, just happy. I answered honestly before I could stop myself, something vague about figuring things out, about feeling stuck between who I was and who I was expected to be. Daniel didn't interrupt. He listened with the patience of someone who understood restraint, who knew the weight of unspoken things. When he nodded, it wasn't encouragement or judgment. It was recognition. As I stood to leave, our hands brushed accidentally, a minor collision that sent a sharp awareness through me. He withdrew immediately, apologizing, but the moment stayed with me long after I returned to my routine. That evening, Ryan asked why I seemed distracted. I told him I was tired. It was true, just not complete. Lying in bed later, I replayed the day in fragments: Daniel's steady voice, his careful distance, the question he hadn't answered for me but had dared to ask. I knew, even then, that nothing inappropriate had happened. I also knew that something had begun. And what unsettled me most wasn't the possibility of consequences, it was the quiet realization that I wanted to go back into that office, sit across from him again, and see what else he might notice. The fourth time Daniel Harris asked me to come to his office, I didn't feel nervous. That realization alone should have stopped me. Instead, I straightened my shirt, told myself it was just work, and followed the now familiar path down the hall as if it belonged to me. Daniel closed the door gently, a habit I'd begun to notice. He asked about my classes, my workload, the kind of questions that sounded casual but carried intent. I answered easily, too easily, aware of how natural it felt to sit across from him and speak without editing myself. With Ryan, I often chose words carefully to avoid conflict. With Daniel, the words came unfiltered. Our conversations drifted beyond schedules and responsibilities. Daniel spoke about the pressure of leadership, about how authority could isolate rather than empower. He mentioned a marriage that had ended quietly, without scandal, dissolving more from neglect than anger. He did not ask for sympathy, but the vulnerability was unmistakable. I found myself offering understanding instead of distance. When he asked if I was seeing anyone, the question landed with a precision that made my breath hitch. I said yes, quickly, naming Ryan as if the truth itself could serve as a barrier. Daniel nodded, accepting the answer without comment, yet something in his expression shifted, subtle, restrained, unmistakably human. After that, the office felt different. Not charged, but attuned, like two people adjusting to a frequency only they could hear. I began to notice how often I thought about those meetings. I replayed his words while shelving files, caught myself smiling at nothing during lectures. At home, Ryan talked about work frustrations and weekend plans, and I responded with appropriate noises, my mind elsewhere. I hated that part of myself, the one that compared the stillness Daniel offered to the noise I felt with Ryan. The fifth meeting was shorter. Daniel seemed distracted, his composure fractionally fractured. He asked about my future, whether I planned to stay in education or move on. I admitted I didn't know, that indecision had become a kind of shelter. He said he understood that too well. You don't have to have everything mapped out, he said. Some paths only make sense once you're already on them. Quote, the words lingered long after I left, heavy with implication whether he intended them to be or not. That night, Ryan reached for me in bed, his touch familiar and expectant. I let it happen, but my thoughts betrayed me, drifting back to a quiet office and a man who asked questions without demanding answers. Guilt followed close behind, sharp and undeniable. I turned away afterward, claiming exhaustion, hating how easy the lie felt. I told myself nothing physical had crossed a line. I told myself thoughts weren't actions. Still, I started deleting call logs from the office phone, small acts of concealment that felt disproportionate to their cause. Each deletion drew a boundary I pretended not to see. During the sixth meeting, Daniel broke the rhythm. He asked me to sit, then hesitated, as if recalibrating. Ethan, he said carefully, I need to make sure we're being appropriate. The word appropriate landed between us, solid and necessary. My heart pounded, unsure whether I was relieved or disappointed. I value these conversations, he continued, but I don't want to put you in a position that's unfair, to you or to anyone else. I nodded, grateful for the permission to pretend nothing had changed, even as the disappointment settled deeper than I expected. I assured him I understood, that professionalism mattered. We both performed restraint convincingly. As I stood to leave, Daniel spoke again, softer this time. If you ever need guidance, about school or life, I'm here. The offer was framed as mentorship, but we both understood the ambiguity. I left with the uneasy comfort of knowing the door wasn't fully closed. At home, Ryan confronted me for the first time. Not angrily, but with a confusion that hurt more. You feel far away, he said. Like you're somewhere else even when you're here. I denied it reflexively, then paused. The truth pressed against my teeth, dangerous and inconvenient. I told him I was stressed, uncertain about the future. He accepted the explanation, though his eyes suggested doubt. Later, alone, I acknowledged what I'd been avoiding. I was already betraying him, not with my body, but with my attention, my honesty, my longing. The realization didn't stop me. When Daniel called me in again the following week, I didn't hesitate before going. I only wondered, as I walked down the hall, how much further I was willing to let this go before someone made a choice I could no longer undo. Ryan didn't raise his voice when he finally asked me to sit down. That frightened me more than anger would have. His calm carried a weight that suggested he'd already reached conclusions without me, that he was giving me a chance to catch up. Are you talking to someone else? He asked. The question was precise, not accusatory. I could have answered it honestly with a simple no and still been lying. I hesitated long enough for the silence to answer for me. I haven't done anything, I said, then corrected myself. Not physically. Ryan exhaled slowly, the sound edged with disappointment rather than relief. That's not what I asked. I told him about Daniel Harris in careful fragments, stripping the story of anything that sounded incriminating while knowing the truth lived between the omissions. As I spoke, I watched Ryan's expression shift, from confusion to hurt to a distant kind of clarity. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He listened the way people do when they're preparing to let go. "You're not here anymore," he said when I finished. "You haven't been for a while." There was nothing to contradict him with. I tried to explain how unseen I'd felt, how the attention had crept up on me, how I hadn't meant for it to matter. The words sounded thin even to me, excuses masquerading as explanations. Ryan stood, gathering his jacket. "I hope you figure out what you're looking for," he said quietly. "But don't pretend you didn't already choose." The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the apartment. I sat alone, surrounded by the residue of a life that had felt permanent until it wasn't. The next morning, Daniel's office felt smaller. The air was heavier, charged with the awareness of consequences. He noticed immediately that something was wrong, the perceptiveness that had drawn me to him now cutting uncomfortably close. I told him about Ryan. I didn't blame him, didn't accuse, but I didn't protect him either. I laid the truth out plainly, stripped of fantasy. Daniel listened with his hands folded, his expression tightening not with guilt but with recognition. "This can't continue," he said when I finished. His voice was steady, but there was regret in it. "Not like this. The imbalance alone makes it wrong." I nodded, surprised by the relief that accompanied the disappointment. Hearing him name what I'd avoided gave shape to the unease I'd been carrying. "I should have set firmer boundaries sooner," Daniel continued. "That's on me. You were looking for something, and I let myself be part of that instead of stopping it." There was no confession of shared longing, no dramatic declaration to soften the blow. Just responsibility, offered plainly. It hurt more than rejection would have. He told me he'd requested a transfer to a different administrative role the following semester, a move framed as professional but motivated by necessity. Distance, he said, was the only ethical solution left. When I stood to leave, the familiar urge to linger surfaced one last time. Daniel met my eyes, the warmth still there but contained now, disciplined. "You deserve a relationship that doesn't live in the shadows," he said. "Make sure you don't mistake attention for intimacy again." Outside his office, the hallway looked the same, but I moved through it differently, aware of how easily I'd confused being noticed with being known. Days passed. Ryan didn't call. I didn't expect him to. The quiet forced reflection, uncomfortable and unavoidable. I replayed my choices without the protective haze of infatuation, seeing where I'd stepped away from honesty long before anything overt occurred. What I missed wasn't Daniel specifically. It was the version of myself that had felt awake, affirmed, temporarily whole. Understanding that distinction didn't absolve me, but it did teach me something I couldn't afford to ignore. On my last afternoon shift before winter break, I packed files into storage boxes and powered down my computer. As I left the building, I glanced once toward the administrative wing, knowing I wouldn't be called there again. The story didn't end with redemption or reunion. It ended with clarity, earned at a cost I hadn't anticipated. I had crossed a line without touching it, betrayed someone without intending harm, and learned that desire can be as disruptive as action. Walking into the cold evening air, I understood that self-discovery wasn't a single revelation but a series of choices. Some you make deliberately, others you realize only after they've already changed you.